Welcome in, everybody, to a new edition of Typhoon Streams. I'm Tyler Springs. Great to be with you. Glad you're joining us, and please like and subscribe to all of doing here this YouTube channel, which is going to get American conference related, athletic conference related, a little bit of WNBA from time to time. It's on lock. But today I wanted to come to you. We are in home stretch toward fall. Kids coming back to classes. Go over the American Athletic Conference women's basketball picture and one transfer portal in 2024. Now I'm gonna go over a few things. Start with, I think you'll, after I put those things on the table, coming from. First off, I'm not gonna do anything crazy because you know kind of where I'm coming from. I live in Memphis. I do play-by-play for women's basketball for the University of Memphis. Love doing it for the Simmons. And I think they're solidly in the mix. You want to say, hey, this guy's biased, doesn't know what he's talking about. Feel free. Just my 2 cents on looking at in terms of setting up for. That's part of where I'm coming from. What I would also say is this video is not going to tell you who's going to win the league this year. Not going to tell you who has the best roster overall. It's also not going to tell you failing as a coach or who's recruiting the best necessarily. All this is telling you is, in my opinion, who had the best transfer portal class. Not use any impact freshmen. Hard to know. Right? Freshmen can be ranked highly and also not make it. In terms of players who have played the NCAA level, who's going to come in and make an immediate impact in a huge my evaluation of that. Where is my math? Well, I would tell you that the categories that I use to try and evaluate this, again, some of it is not apples to apples, okay? Playing in a smaller conference not necessarily mean that production is going to be the same in a larger conference like the American. A lot of players who are kind of jumping up a step in order to play AAC women's basketball. There are some who've come down from power conferences, and we'll get to those. If you played at a power conference and you played at a high level, I think that's meaningful. I think that matters in the context of what you're going to be able to do in the American. But I would also say that mostly what I've broken down here is I capped players I was trying to analyze at players who had averaged 6 points per game or better, and also you have a high level of PER times minutes played and a solid win shares. But I capped it, generally speaking, players who were joining American Athletic Conference teams for the 2024-2025 campaign, and they recently averaged at least 6 points per game on whatever team they were last on. Plenty of transfers get added every year who did not average a ton of points on the previous team that they were on, but based on what I've seen from last year, these are the players who last year stood out in such a way that they averaged at least 6 points. They say 6 points per game. That's not that much, but 6 points per game means, you got maybe some weak games in there, but I would say you've also got some double-figure games in there. You can score at least a decent amount wherever you are game the course of a long season. For some of the players that I'm analyzing, bear in mind, I looked at their statistics and try to be generous in terms of saying, okay, if I were a coach, I'm not necessarily looking at who this player was immediately this past season, because a lot of these kids are changing situations because they wanted a new situation. Felt like they didn't, maybe fit in the situation they were currently in, and they wanted to try something else that would get them, their peak performance, right? So some of these players, when I looked at what they did in previous programs, if they had, let's say, 2 years ago, a better stat line than they had last year, or they didn't play a full season last year, tried to give them benefit of the doubt and say, okay, if I'm a coach looking at this player coming in for my program, how can I use them? I want to look and see where has their peak been previously. Can I bring that back and can I expand upon it? Some of these kids, in terms of doing the numbers, I looked at the seasons probably 2 years prior to this one rather than just last year. They were better, played a larger share of minutes, and maybe the minutes declined or scored more points than the points declined because of changes in the last year, things that might have made change situations this year. So that's where I'm coming from on this, and try to be fairly transparent with what I've used there. All this statistical information is available on herhoopstats.com, which is a site to keep women's basketball. I've shout out to folks, and they work that better inform people who want to learn about women's basketball and making an impact. So that leads me to my list. You comb through the American, and I want to say first, looked at a couple of teams, at least I looked at a couple of teams where I don't think they added anybody scored at least 6 points per game last year or the season before. A couple of teams that fell into that category. One was Florida Atlantic, who was trying to rally out of the bottom of the conference. It's going to be a big year for Jennifer Sullivan's crew, but they did not necessarily add anybody points per game previous roster season. Different team last year. The other two teams who didn't really add that way were the two teams that ended up in the American Athletic Conference final this past season. That was Rice and ECU. And I think we know that those two teams, given where they landed last year and the fact that ECU went to the tournament 2 years ago, those teams, I'm not saying they are weak necessarily by not adding someone from the transfer portal, right? I think you can measure success in a lot of different ways. They chose not to augment their roster with high-level scores or say high production scores, right? In terms of the people they added, a lot of those teams have players coming back from injury who are going to make a big impact this year, so maybe they didn't really have room on the roster to add somebody from the transfer portal. But I think they're also counting on internal growth players they've already got rostered. They've shown clearly they can win at a high level, being that they were the women's basketball championship last March. Quick tip of the cap to those teams. I won't mention them very much. Didn't add anybody 6+ a game transfer portal, but that doesn't mean they're going to be a bad team. Now, when we get to the transfer portal, it was hard for me, in spots. Sometimes not hard, sometimes it is. But to try and look at who gets added and what makes the most difference, right? Like teams like Tulsa and Wichita State, they're not going to be near the top of my sort of quote-unquote transfer portal rankings because they only really added one player per team who scored at least 6 points per game last year. Jamison coming over from George Mason to Wichita State from, then Crystal Aitken, I believe, coming from Jacksonville State, bumping up to Tulsa. And listen, those kids can certainly be impact players at this level, but I think when you look at the overall breadth and depth of what was added to those rosters, Wichita State and for Tulsa, from the transfer portal specifically, I was not necessarily impressed by those two additions. See how it plays out. Nooner still getting his feet wet, kind of getting settled and finding an identity for Wichita State. Angie Nelp having to replace Tyra Poindexter, Tulsa. All task, the likes of Lenny Crawford, Maddie Cartwright coming back. Also, good team again, based on what they already have in that roster and based. A lot to look at there. Not going to hear me talk a lot about those teams again because adding only one player and adding a player didn't necessarily score at a high level and didn't come from a powerful league. Them more toward the bottom of my. There are a lot of ways you can go with the teams who did add talent. I would also mention that not everybody added a ton in terms of added like multiple pieces. Some added only one or two. Some added, 4, 5, 6 pieces. A handful that added a lot that scored. So not all additions count equal. I think a lot of teams were competitive in the transfer portal. And by the way, that's great to see for the American Athletic Conference. The fact that players want to come to the American and feel like there are opportunities here. I think that is awesome going forward. But when I look at the transfer portal hauls brought in, there are a few that stand out, and I'll try and delineate how. Obviously, two programs getting new head coaches in are going to do serious rebuilding. Right? Tulane because they finished at the bottom of the league. Tip at the cap to Lisa Stockton for incredible tenure at Tulane. They go and get Ashley Langford from Stony Brook. She brought two key impact players with her in Sharice Pittman and also got Kiani Westbrook from the. So I think when you look at rosters like Tulane and then Charlotte and the massive rebuild that Charlotte had to do following Kara Consuegra, Marquette, bring in Tamiki Arena, had a ton of success at Jackson State for a couple of years now. He really turned that roster over. I think it's going to be hard to read what that team looks like, but she got, I think, the most in terms of aggregate talent added. Right, she added the most pieces, sort of stacked their stats on one on top of the other. That might be the highest contribution to the Charlotte lineup in terms of transfer portal impact. Whether or not they're all going to play, they're all going to be good, it's yet to be seen, right? But she added a lot. That does speak to aggressiveness when you're looking to, hey, start and hit the ground running. Miki Arena brought in the class, I think, that had, on aggregate, most backed players. Brought in, I believe, 4 players who scored 6 points per game from last season. And that's big. So Jordan Peete, Demetria Shepard, Daphne White, and Alexis Andrews. I don't want to. I try to hit all those players' name, but it is one of those things. A lot. Alexis Andrews coming over from College of Charleston. That's right. So I think on balance, Charlotte added probably the most pieces that have the potential to make an impact in the. All those players can score. Andrews in particular, I think, really found her form as a sophomore at Charlotte. And Daphne White brings a post presence, I think, that is going to be, I would say, probably emblematic of what Charlotte does, because who follow Jackson State, they've done the last couple of years. They have certainly had imposing interior players. That is, I think, probably going to be a hallmark of their team. Could be a hallmark. Charlotte trying to read the tea leaves early. Daphne White, pack players. Those are the 4 that 6 plus points per game. Elsewhere, I think it's obvious that rebuilding rosters are going to have a lot of pieces added to them. See a little bit of that as well. I think with North Texas, had a great debut season, tying for the league lead season, and bring back Misha Lampkin, who's a tremendous player. They lose Desiree Colonel. They are looking to rebuild. They added 3 players who scored points per game. Some of them, I think all of them coming from quote unquote smaller conferences. How that plays out. Injection there in terms of trying to add from the. When you look at who else added and added in ways, I think that 3-person class of Kyla Deck, Bell Jack, or Bell Tack, Jalen Talley, I think that can be a good class, certainly, and impactful. Burton last year, you can hit the ground running, right? You can certainly do that in this conference, and he did it coming over from A&M Commerce. It'll be interesting to see what that looks like. Other schools were a little more selective, like South Florida adds Mama Dembele from Mizzou, 10 points per game. Also a point guard that can kind of drive the ship. Did it in Southeastern Conference. And they bring in also an offensive rebounder in an Piper. I think those are 2 really, really good ads. PSA got deeper in the backcourt with Nina De Leon LeBron. Kept somebody kind of in-house, quote unquote, inside the same city, coming over from Incarnate Word, San Antonio. Temple, I think, went out and took some flyers on Maya Oliver, and Kayla Turner. Turner, young scorer coming out of Alabama A&M. Oliver had a really good year. Former USC commit, had a really good year last year for Marymount, Los Angeles. think that'll be probably helpful to Diane Richardson's side. You look at Memphis, and they went to go and get Quinn Fulmore and Tilly Bowler, actually both of whom who have played against the University of Memphis previously, not necessarily when Alex Simmons was coaching. Played Towson and Jackson State against Memphis years ago. Memphis played those Meriwether. But I think you go and you get scoring guard, the lead scorer for a Jackson State team that has won highly over the last couple of years, and then Quinn Fulmore, who maybe was a little bit down in terms of impact last year for Towson, but has been on a Towson team that's won a bunch of games last couple of years. Needed to have some size on the inside as well. You're losing players, Green and Brown. Those are good ads. Who have I not gotten to? I think I got to most of the class. Well, the one I haven't touched on, honestly, probably the most impressive, just as your eye meets it in terms of who gets added, was UAB. A team that I think lost their last 6 games of the year, kind of stumbled down the backstretch, and then you lose Moore and you lose Benham to Shields. Transfer portal. Randy Norton had his work cut out for him, but he goes and gets Nia Hubbard to come back home. I think she's from the Hoover, Alabama area, and pair her with Callie Smallwood, who's scored well as a freshman at a division school out of Iowa, and but Rain Tucker, a veteran forward, comes over from Temple, already knows this conference the same way Hubbard knows this conference. So I think putting those pieces together, that I think pops off the screen in terms of saying, okay, these are players who can score, can make an impact, and I think 2 of them very familiar conference, and the one doesn't have to go very far. I think those are got play B in terms of what they're. But I think when it comes down to it, look across kind of the landscape of American, and if you're trying to pick a team where you feel like, all right, these are the biggest pieces and they're going to make the biggest impact, team that they are arriving on, I think I have to lean, and maybe this is a little bit of, I lean on USF. I think South Florida has been the class of this league for a long time. Suffered with some injuries last year and didn't probably as much as people expected them to. They're going to reload this year. But that's all from what was already on their roster. For them to add 2 things, I think that they do really, really well are move the ball and crash the offensive. I think they added 2 players in Ahmad Dembele and Inez Piper, who those things, in addition to being players who can basketball. I think they added 2 players who will help in 2 key elements of their offensive operation. I think that cannot be understood enough after you get the conference title. That I think warrants some respect in terms of being selective about who you go and get, but also knowing kind of who it is that you can go and get and convincing them, hey, this is the right place. Those look like kind of like hand-in-glove fits South Florida. I think that's part of why the Bulls are going to do damage once again. I think reasonable people can disagree, and I'm not necessarily saying those 2 players can outweigh necessarily, 4 or 5 or 6 players that other teams were able to add. But I think if you're looking for kind of 2 big support under bridge that you're building this basketball for them from the transfer, I think adding Mama DeBelle and Piper are probably the best 2 ads as a pairing. A lot of competition. I think ads have been on winning teams. That certainly helps. I think UAB's familiarity with the conference in their ads certainly helps. So, and there's going to be a lot of mixed bags out there as well. Stony Brook won at an incredibly high level over the last couple of years. See if Pittman and Keenan can kind of anchor that team. And Jackson State certainly has known winning in big ways over the last. So we'll see how Mickey Reed wrangle things over there in 1 at Charlotte. Would love to hear people's comments. Disagree with me. Feel free to get at me at Typhoon Springs on Twitter or typhoonstreams@gmail.com. That's just currently how I see things with SF standing out. Transfer So please like, subscribe, and feel free to check out the other videos on this channel. We'll try and bring you more women's basketball content at both the pro and the college level as we forward into fall, and maybe some UFL, NFL, college football stuff as well, and some Memphis-related items as well. I'm Tyler Springs. Thanks so much for tuning in on this episode of Typhoon Stream.